People who still give credence to GOP election promises are understandably sulking with disappointment over the recent budget vote in the House of Representatives. Half the GOP congressional caucus joined with the Democrats to reject the budget cuts required to meet the GOP's already laughably inadequate commitment to support a paltry $100 billion cutback in prospective spending. Believe if you like that this is just about the failure of individual Congress critters to man up and do the needful. In fact, it is the inevitable result of the simple truth that both political parties are big government junkies. Both parties rely on government power and the spending required to fuel it as the raw material of their political machinery. Their game plan during elections is simple. Promise people whatever your pollsters tell you they want to hear. Once in power, do whatever it takes to stay there, no matter what it costs. This is the sly principle of the politics of elite domination that characterizes the present so-called two-party system. Elitist peddlers of socialism often deploy the rhetoric of unity or solidarity in their efforts to beguile the multitude. But when it comes to action, they implement an approach to politics that actually requires that people be divided into competing groups. This is particularly true of the coalition-building political model that has been typical of the Democratic Party since the New Deal era. With promises of patronage and special favors, the party induces differing groups to work toward the common goal of winning government power. The elite manipulators of the party system select or co-opt leaders from these groups, then play them off against one another. Much like the owners of a rigged casino, they allow each group to see itself as the victor just long enough to sustain the false hope that keeps them on the premises. But they never allow any group, or combination of groups, to win enough to challenge or interfere with the elite's exclusive control of the process. The supposed unity of these groups is a Tinseltown facade. Moved by the same lust for power, they end up playing on the same premises, that's true. But they're not intrinsically bound together in any way. They have a common interest in the same external commodities, money and power. But otherwise they retain their radically different purposes and identities. Like the gamblers in a casino, they keenly hunger for victory. But beyond this, they have no common sense of the good to be achieved by victory. They form a community of sorts, but it only exists as an incidental consequence of the fabricated opportunity for abstract gain the gambling enterprise, in this case the political party, continually dangles in front of them. While loudly proclaiming their opposition to the elitist Democrat socialist approach to government, the elitist Republicans have for some time simply accepted and acted on this New Deal understanding of politics. To be sure, the two parties contend that they build their coalitions on very different premises. The Democrats are all about government programs. They use tax receipts to fund them so that they can put their partisan buddies in a position to amass power for themselves. They do so readily, as a matter of fact, by expending and manipulating the government's direct control over the redistribution of national resources. On the other hand, the Republicans manipulate the government's indirect control over the distribution of national resources. They do this by manipulating the tax rates, which determine how much control people retain over the money they earn. In this way, the GOP can promise to protect the gains its partisans directly amass through their ostensibly private work and enterprise. The two parties are different, all right, like rival factions of an organized crime syndicate. The Democrats devise government programs that are like different rackets that they divide into tax-funded territories. Then they parcel out control and distribution of the budgets for those territories among the different groups working to maintain the party's political power base. The Republicans, on the other hand, use government office to establish a protection scheme. In exchange for political support, they promise to shield their partisans from the excessive collections the Democrats use to fund their rackets. Both parties believe in winning through intimidation. The Republicans play on the public's fear of what the Democrats will take from them. The Democrats play on the public's fear of what selfish Republicans will keep them from getting. The standard Republican Party tactic? is to lure their adherents with promises of restrained spending and taxes and intimidate them with the threat of Democrat tax cuts. Meanwhile, the standard Democrat Party tactic lures their adherents with promised programs and threatens them with selfish Republican spending cuts. Either way, it is the government's actual or potential abuse of our national resources that's manipulated to favor the prospects of one party or the other. The elite's media minions, meanwhile, encourage the public to be preoccupied with the two parties' mock combat with one another. As a result, most people fail to notice that the definition of politics accepted by both parties gives each a stake in preserving the power position of the government, and also, ironically, a tacit stake in assuring the periodic success of their opponents. Government power fuels and lubricates the machinery of political control in both parties, in the form of official patronage, government jobs or contracts, in the form of protection, like tax provisions that favor this or that corporation or interest groups, or in the form of direct largesse, corporate and individual credit deals and transfer payments. This gives the party bosses the wherewithal to energize and discipline their supporters. And without the periodic successes of their supposed opponents, what would become of the fear each manipulates to keep their supporters in harness? For the Republicans, this government-dependent approach to politics ought to be deeply problematical. That is, assuming that any supporters of the GOP actually think it through. The GOP loudly proclaims its respect for the principle of limited government. Yet as long as it continues to follow the New Deal Democrats' paradigm for politics, its behavior will reflect the perception that to survive politically, Republicans too must preserve the government's unlimited power potential. Because according to the New Deal model, the only way to maintain political unity is by directing the actual use of government power so that it benefits your friends and harms your opponents. The Republican Party's grassroots supporters lament the inconsistency between the party's election rhetoric and its actual performance. They ask in frustration why GOP candidates who pledge fiscal discipline become GOP legislators who practice the same old tax and spend, borrow and spend insanity. The answer lies in the contradiction between the party's pretended view of responsible government and its irresponsible practice of cynical New Deal politics. During the opening session of the newly elected House of Representatives, the members read aloud from the Constitution of the United States. Did any of them notice that it makes no mention of political parties? Will any of them remember that its provisions were framed to implement an understanding of political motives that sees beyond a lust for money and power? Will they recall the Declaration of Independence and its emphasis on rights with which the nation began? A declaration that makes respect for justice, as endowed by our Creator, the common good that unifies the American people, and that is supposed to make of us an example of liberty fit to inspire and substantiate the decent hopes of all humanity. Unless the American people initiate a movement to return to this understanding, we'll never escape the specter of bankruptcy and decline, produced by a party system that drives the parties to use government power to feed and service elite ambition, no matter what the cost, to us now or to our children and our grandchildren in the years to come.